Tuesday afternoon in October of 1995, a 49-year-old forklift driver named Harold Crawford walked into Riverstone Community Bank in Cedarbrook, Iowa, carrying a $327 payroll check drawn on that bank's own accounts. The manager, a man named Vernon Mason, with a watch that was a little too loud and a tie that was a little too shiny, charged him $40 in cash to cash it. Two men standing at the teller windows laughed. Harold Crawford paid the fee. He did not say a word. And by the time he walked out that door, he was already carrying the one thing that would cost Continental Heritage Financial $847,500 23 years later. A blue composition notebook from the Cedarbrook Drug Store, $1.19. His name was Harold William Crawford. People who knew him called him Harold. He was 49 years old that October. He had been driving a forklift at Cedarbrook Grain Processing for 15 years, and he made $11.50 an hour. And he had a wife named Marlene who had been with him for 19 years, and a daughter named Ellie, who was 12 years old and in the 7th grade at Cedarbrook Middle School. He lived in a small white house on Plumridge Road, 11 miles south of town, with 11 years left on a $52,000 mortgage and an F-150 pickup truck from 1987 that he kept clean even when nobody was looking. He was not a man who made scenes. He was not a man who raised his voice. He had spent most of his life learning that being right was less important than being still. That October, the elevator at the grain plant had cut his hours by 2 days because of a power generator problem, and the check in his hand on the way home that Tuesday afternoon was for a half week of work, $327.42. He had driven 17 miles of gravel road into town. The credit union where he had cashed his paychecks for the last 11 years had closed its doors without warning the Friday before. A small printed notice taped to the inside of the glass door had said something about regulatory consolidation and directed customers to call a number with a Des Moines area code. Harold had stood at the door for almost a full minute reading the notice twice. Then he had gotten back in his truck and driven down Main Street, looking for somewhere else to cash his check. Riverstone Community Bank sat on the corner of 2nd and Grand. Brick front, pillars, brass plaque by the door. The kind of small-town bank that had been there since the 1930s. Harold had never been inside before. He did not have an account there. He did not want one. He just needed the money his employer had already paid him. He pushed through the brass frame glass door at 27 minutes past 3. The lobby smelled like furniture polish and old paper. There were 2 tellers at the long counter. There were 3 customers in line ahead of him. Harold stood quietly. He held his cap in one hand. He held the check in the other. He waited. When his turn came, he slid the check across the counter and asked if he could cash it. The teller was a young woman in her 20s with a name tag that said Brenda. She picked up the check. She looked at it. She looked at Harold. She set the check down. She said, "Do you have an account with us, sir?" Harold said, "No, ma'am, I do not. But the check is drawn on your bank." Brenda said, "One moment, please." She picked up the check and she walked down the counter to a glass-walled office at the end of the lobby. The office had its blinds open. Harold could see her standing inside the office talking to a man who was sitting at a desk. The man had his back partly turned. He was wearing a navy suit jacket and a tie. Harold could see the watch on his left wrist even through the glass. It was a heavy gold-colored watch. It caught the overhead lights. The man looked up. He looked across the lobby at Harold. He looked back at Brenda. He said something Harold could not hear. Brenda walked back to the counter. She slid the check back across to Harold. She said, "Sir, you will need to speak with our manager. He will assist you. His name is Mr. Mason. The office at the end." Harold thanked her. He picked up the check. He walked the length of the counter to the glass-walled office. Vernon Mason was 47 years old. He had been the manager of Riverstone Community Bank for 9 years. Before that, he had been a regional sales coordinator for a stationery wholesaler in Cedar Rapids. He had a way of looking at people that started at their shoes. He looked at Harold's shoes first. They were brown leather work boots, 8 years old, well kept with a dried streak of clay on the right toe that Harold had not noticed before he came inside. Then Mason looked at the check. He said, "This is a payroll check from Cedarbrook Grain." Harold said, "Yes, sir." Mason said, "Drawn on our institution." Harold said, "Yes, sir." Mason said, "And you are not a customer of this bank?" Harold said, "No, sir." Mason set the check down on his desk blotter. He folded his hands on top of it. He looked up at Harold for the first time, and his eyes were the eyes of a man calculating how much of his afternoon this was gonna take. He said, "Non-customer check cashing fee is $40. Cash only. We do not bill against the check." Harold stood very still for a moment. He said, "The check is drawn on your bank." Mason said, "That is correct, sir." Harold said, "My paycheck is for $327. "I'm aware of the amount," Mason said. Harold said, "That is a $40 fee on a $327 check." Mason said, "That is our policy, sir. If you would like to open a checking account today, the fee can be waived and your check can be deposited and made available to you within 3 business days. The minimum opening balance is $100. Harold looked at the check on the blotter. He thought for a brief moment about turning around and walking out, about driving another 20 miles to the next town and trying his luck at the savings and loan in Greenfield. But it was already past 3:30 in the afternoon. The drive to Greenfield was 40 minutes one way. The savings and loan closed at 4. He had $214 in his pocket, and that was the household money for the next 2 weeks. He needed the cash. Tonight, he reached into the pocket of his canvas jacket. The left one, the one with the torn seam Marlene had been asking him to bring to her for the last 3 weeks. He counted out 2 $20 bills. He laid them on the corner of Mason's desk. Mason picked up the bills. He counted them. He nodded once. He pulled an adding machine across the desk. He typed. The machine made its small mechanical clatter. He pulled a slip of paper from a tray. He wrote a transaction number. He stamped the back of the check. He stood up. He walked the check to the cashier's drawer at the end of the counter. He counted out $287.42 and slid it across to Harold in a paper sleeve. He said, "Thank you for your business, sir." Harold took the sleeve. He turned to go. Behind him at the teller windows, 2 men had been standing in line waiting their turn. They had heard the whole exchange. Harold did not know either of them by name. He recognized one of them. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with a feed cap and a leather jacket. He worked. Harold thought at the John Deere dealership out on Highway 6. As Harold passed him on the way out, the heavy-set man laughed. It was a short laugh, a low laugh, the kind of laugh that was not really directed at anybody, but was meant for everybody to hear. The other man, the younger one, smiled. Harold did not turn around. He did not look back. He stopped at the literature rack near the exit. There were brochures for a Christmas Club savings account, an auto loan promotion, and a small folded pamphlet with the words, Riverstone Community Bank Services printed in blue letters on the front. Harold took one of the pamphlets. He folded it once and slid it into his coat pocket. Then he pushed through the door. He walked across the parking lot to his truck. He got in. He sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. He looked at the pamphlet sticking out of his coat pocket. He looked at the paper sleeve on the seat beside him. He thought about what had happened. He thought about the two men at the teller windows. He thought about Vernon Mason's gold-colored watch. He thought about the $40 he had just paid in cash to a man who had not so much as said hello to him before he said the word policy. He turned the key. The engine started. He drove the 17 miles home. It was almost 5 o'clock when he pulled into the driveway. Marlene had a pot of beef stew going on the stove. The smell hit him when he opened the back door. Ellie was at the kitchen table doing her math homework. She looked up when he came in. She said, "Hi, Dad." He said, "Hi, sweetheart." He hung his coat on the hook by the door. He set the paper sleeve from the bank on the kitchen counter. Marlene was at the stove with her back to him. She said, "How was town?" Harold said, "Fine." She turned around. She looked at him. Marlene Crawford was 50 years old that fall. She had been married to Harold for 19 years. She had grown up 2 counties over in a farming family that had lost everything in the 80s farm crisis. And she had a way of reading her husband's face that did not require him to say very much. She looked at him now. She looked at the paper sleeve on the counter. She looked back at him. She said the credit union. Harold said, still closed. "I went to Riverstone. Marlene said all right." She turned back to the stove. She stirred the stew. She said supper in 15 minutes. Harold sat down at the kitchen table across from his daughter. He pulled the pamphlet out of his coat pocket. He smoothed it flat on the table with the side of his hand. He read the cover. Riverstone Community Bank Services. Member FDIC. Established 1934. Then he opened it and read page 2. Then he turned to page 3. Page 3 was titled, Fee Schedule for Non-Customer Transactions. Harold read it slowly. Then he read it again. The fee schedule listed money order fees, wire transfer fees, cashier's check fees, and notary service fees. It listed 7 different fees. The fees ranged from $3 to $25. There was no entry for non-customer check cashing. There was no mention of a $40 fee. There was no mention of any fee for cashing a check drawn on Riverstone's own accounts. Harold folded the pamphlet exactly as he had found it. He set it down on the table. After supper, when Ellie had gone to her room to read, Harold went down to the small workshop at the back of the basement where he kept his tools and a workbench his father had built in 1967. He pulled open the second drawer of the metal filing cabinet next to the workbench. He took out a brand new green composition notebook he had bought at the Cedarbrook Drug Store the previous weekend for a list of repairs the F-150 needed before winter. The list had 3 items on it. Harold tore those 3 pages out and threw them away. Then he carried the notebook back up to the kitchen. He sat down at the table. He took the pen out of the cup by the napkin holder. He opened the notebook to the first page. He wrote the date, October 17th, 1995. He wrote Riverstone Community Bank, Cedarbrook, Iowa. Manager Vernon Mason. $40 non-customer fee charged in cash on a payroll check drawn on Riverstone's own account. Check number 70741, issued by Cedarbrook Grain Processing. He thought for a moment. He wrote underneath that they charged me to cash my own money. Then he reached for the pamphlet. He opened it to page 3. He copied the fee schedule into the notebook. He wrote no $40 fee disclosed in the printed schedule. No mention of any fee for cashing checks drawn on Riverstone's own accounts. He put the pen down. Marlene came in from the living room with 2 mugs of coffee. She set one down next to his elbow. She looked at the notebook. She looked at the pamphlet. She did not ask any questions. She said, "You working on something?" Harold said, "I am." She nodded. She picked up her own mug. She walked back out toward the living room. At the doorway, she stopped. She said over her shoulder, "The seam in your coat. Bring it down tomorrow. I will fix it." He said, "All right." She left. He looked at the notebook in front of him for a long time. He thought about the word policy. He thought about the way Vernon Mason had said it, the way men in offices said words like that to make them sound like laws. He thought about a pamphlet he had read once years ago in the waiting room of a state employment office that had explained a federal banking term he did not remember in detail, but he remembered the name of. The word was disclosure. He did not write it down yet. He did not need to. He just held it in his head where it sat the way a small piece of metal sits in a pocket. He closed the notebook. He slipped a rubber band around it. He put it in the second drawer of the filing cabinet downstairs. He went to bed. Let me tell you about the Cedarbrook Public Library, because what happened there over the next 18 months is the part of this story most people never see. The library sat in a 1-story brick building on Walnut Street, 2 blocks east of the bank. It had been built in 1953 with money from a county bond and a small donation from a coal heir whose family had no other connection to the town. It had 3 full-time librarians and a basement reference section that did not get a lot of foot traffic. The head reference librarian was a woman named Pauline Reardon, who was 58 years old that fall and who had grown up in Cedarbrook and who had been working in libraries since 1962. She knew most of the regulars by sight. She did not know Harold Crawford. Harold came in on a Saturday morning in late October, 6 days after his trip to the bank. He had spent the week thinking. He had spent the week looking at the pamphlet at night after Marlene went to bed. He had decided sometime around Thursday that the question he wanted answered was not whether what Vernon Mason had done was unfair. It was whether what Vernon Mason had done was legal. He did not know how to find the answer to that question. He had finished the 11th grade and gone to work at his uncle's auto body shop, and from there to the grain elevator. And he had never set foot inside a law library or read a federal regulation. But he knew that public libraries had reference sections. And he knew that reference sections had people who were paid to help. He asked the woman at the front desk who he should talk to about banking laws. She pointed him toward Pauline Reardon at the reference desk in the basement. Pauline looked up when he came down the stairs. He was carrying his cap in his hand the way he had at the bank. He was wearing the same canvas jacket. The seam in the left pocket was still torn. He had not yet taken it down to Marlene. He said, "I am looking for information on federal banking rules." Pauline said, "Any particular kind?" He said, "The rules about what a bank has to tell you before they charge you a fee." Pauline looked at him for a moment. She was an experienced reference librarian. She had answered 10,000 questions in her career. She could tell when someone was working on something. She nodded once. She said that would be a federal disclosure rule. "We have the regulations bound in the reference stacks. I will show you where." She walked him over to aisle 7. The aisle was lined floor to ceiling with thick green binders. Each binder had a year stamped on the spine. Pauline pulled out the binder for 1979. She set it on the wooden table at the end of the aisle. She said Federal Reserve commentary on banking regulations. Start here. There is an index in the front. If you do not find what you are looking for, come find me. She did not ask him why he wanted to know. She did not ask him who he was. She put a small porcelain cup of coffee from the staff room down on the table next to the binder. She said, "Take your time." She walked away. Harold sat down at the table. He opened the binder. He spent the next 2 hours in aisle 7 that Saturday morning. He almost missed it. The paragraph that mattered was on page 31 of a 1979 Federal Reserve commentary printed on paper that had gone the color of old butter. It was a small paragraph. It did not have a heading. It was buried in a longer section about what banks were required to disclose to customers and non-customers. Harold read it twice. He sat very still. The paragraph referenced 2 federal statutes, the Bank Secrecy Act of 1974 and the Expedited Funds Availability Act of 1987. Together, these statutes created a requirement. Before a bank charged a non-customer any fee to cash a check drawn on that bank's own accounts, the bank was required to disclose that fee. Not during the transaction, not on the receipt afterward. Before, the disclosure had to be conspicuous, posted at the location where the transaction would occur, printed in the bank's published fee schedule in a manner reasonably visible to non-customers. The paragraph cited Regulation CC, which was the Federal Reserve regulation implementing the disclosure requirement. Harold thought about the brass plaque outside the bank. He thought about the lobby. He thought about the wall behind the teller windows. There had been no posted notice. He had looked. He had looked because he had been standing in line for almost 10 minutes before his turn came, and he had had time to look. There had been an advertisement for a Christmas Club savings account. There had been a notice about holiday hours. There had been no notice about a $40 non-customer check cashing fee. He thought about the pamphlet which contained a printed fee schedule that did not mention any non-customer check cashing fee at all. The disclosure had not been made, not on the wall, not in the pamphlet, not at the counter, not from Vernon Mason's own mouth, before he said the word policy. Harold opened his notebook. He copied the paragraph word for word. He copied the names of both statutes. He copied the page number. He copied the year of the commentary. He underlined the words Bank Secrecy Act of 1974. He underlined the words Expedited Funds Availability Act of 1987. He underlined the words Regulation CC. Then he wrote underneath all of that, Riverstone never said a word before they took it. He closed the notebook. He put the binder back on the shelf. He walked upstairs. He went to the front desk. He thanked the woman there. He thanked Pauline at the reference desk on his way out. He walked out into the October sunlight. He drove home. Marlene was in the kitchen working on a quilt block when he came in. She was wearing reading glasses. She looked up over the rims. She said, "Find what you were looking for." He said a rule they broke. She put her sewing aside. She took off her reading glasses. She looked at him for what felt like a long moment. She said, "How bad?" He said, "Bad enough." She nodded once. She picked her sewing back up. She said, "Supper at 6. Bring me that coat tonight, or I am cutting the pocket off and using it for a potholder." Harold smiled. It was the first time he had smiled in 6 days. He said, "Yes, ma'am." He went down to the basement. He opened the second drawer of the filing cabinet. He took out the notebook. He sat at the workbench and he wrote for almost 2 hours. He wrote down everything he could remember about the transaction, the time, the teller's name, Vernon Mason's exact words, the 2 men at the teller windows, the laugh, the way Mason had stamped the back of the check, the transaction number on the receipt slip, the amount of cash counted out, the paper sleeve, the walk to the truck. He wrote all of it down. He left no detail out. When he was finished, he sat back. He looked at what he had written. He realized something he had not realized while he was writing, which was that none of what he had written was on its own evidence of anything. It was a story about a man being charged a fee. The $40 was real. The check was real. But the federal violation, if there was one, lived in the absence of disclosure, and absences were hard to prove. He needed proof that other people had been treated the same way. He needed proof that Riverstone had a pattern of doing this. He needed proof that somebody somewhere had already noticed. He thought about that for a long time. Then he wrote in the notebook, "Find out who else." Over the next 4 months, Harold went to the Cedarbrook Public Library 9 more times. He sat in aisle 7. He worked his way through the Federal Reserve commentaries. He pulled the county records on banking complaints. He pulled the State Banking Commission filings. He read every issue of the Federal Reserve Regional Bulletin for the previous 5 years. He took notes on everything. In February of 1996, he wrote a Freedom of Information Act request and mailed it to the Federal Reserve Regional Office in Kansas City. He did not tell anyone. He did not tell Marlene. He sent the letter in a plain envelope with a first-class stamp. He requested copies of any audit reports, examination findings, or compliance reviews involving Riverstone Community Bank for the period from 1990 to the present. The response took 4 months. It came in a large manila envelope with a Kansas City postmark. Harold opened it at the kitchen table on a Tuesday afternoon in June after he came home from work. Inside was a 14-page document. It was an audit report. It had been filed in 1996 by a federal examiner whose name was printed at the bottom of every page. The examiner's name was Roselyn Foster. The audit was titled, "Compliance Review, Riverstone Community Bank, Cedarbrook, Iowa." Dated April of 1996, Harold turned to page 9. On page 9, in clear professional language, examiner Roselyn Foster had written the following: "Potential non-compliance identified in non-customer check cashing fee procedures. Disclosure practices inconsistent with Regulation CC requirements. Posted fee schedules at branch locations do not include the non-customer check cashing fee currently being charged. Verbal disclosure to non-customers prior to the transaction not consistently performed. Recommend follow-up review within 12 months. Harold read it twice. Then he read it a third time. The audit had identified the violation. The audit had recommended follow-up. The audit had been filed in April of 1996. It was now June of 1996. 2 months. Plenty of time for follow-up to have been scheduled. Harold turned to the last page of the audit report. There was a routing slip stapled to the back. The routing slip showed the date the report had been received by the bank, the date it had been logged into the regulatory file, and the names of the bank officers who had signed off on receipt. Vernon Mason's signature was the second one. The date of his signature was April 23rd of 1996. There was no follow-up. There was no notation of any subsequent review. There was no record of corrective action. There was no record of anything having happened after Vernon Mason signed the routing slip. The audit had been received. The audit had been filed. The audit had been forgotten. Harold wrote Roselyn Foster's name in the notebook. He wrote page 9. He wrote the date of Vernon Mason's signature. He wrote they already knew. Then he sat at the kitchen table for almost an hour without writing anything else. When Marlene came home from her sewing job at 6:30, she found him still sitting there with the notebook open and the manila envelope spread out across the table. She set her purse down. She walked over. She looked at the document on the table. She did not pick it up. She did not need to. She said that what I think it is. He said federal audit. 2 years ago. They identified the violation. The bank received the report. The bank did nothing. She sat down across from him. She looked at him. She said, "Harold." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you going to file a complaint?" He thought about that for a long time. He said, "Not yet." She nodded. She said, "Why not yet?" He said, "Because if I file a complaint now and they pay a fine, they pay the fine, and they go on charging non-customers a $40 fee tomorrow morning and nothing changes. I need more than this. I need to know how big this is. I need to know if it is just Riverstone or if it is the whole company that owns Riverstone or if it is bigger than that. The $40 is not the thing. The thing is the pattern." Marlene looked at him. She said the pattern. He said yes. She said, "Harold, that could take a long time." He said, "I know." She did not say anything for a while. Then she said, "You sure?" He said, "I am." She nodded. She got up. She went to the stove. She started supper. 3 weeks later, on a Wednesday morning in early July of 1996, Harold was at the Cedarbrook Drug Store picking up a prescription for Marlene when he noticed a small item in the business section of the Cedarbrook Courier, sitting on the counter by the register. It was a 2-paragraph piece halfway down the page. The headline read, "Regional Bank Acquisition Completed." The article reported that Continental Heritage Financial, a multi-state banking holding company headquartered in Indianapolis, had completed the acquisition of Riverstone Community Bank in a transaction valued at $31 million. The acquisition had been finalized the previous Friday. Vernon Mason would continue as branch manager under the new ownership. Continental Heritage planned to retain all current Riverstone branches and personnel, and to introduce expanded product offerings to existing customers over the coming year. Harold paid for the prescription. He took the newspaper home with him. That afternoon, he went back to the library. He sat down in aisle 7. He pulled the Federal Reserve Regional Bulletin Index for the previous 3 years. He looked up Continental Heritage Financial. He found 3 references. The most recent one was from a bulletin dated November of 1995. Continental Heritage Financial had been listed in a Federal Reserve Watch advisory. The advisory cited fee disclosure irregularities in branches operated by Continental Heritage subsidiaries in 4 other states: Missouri, Kentucky, Tennessee, Ohio. The advisory recommended enhanced monitoring of Continental Heritage compliance procedures at the regional level. The advisory did not name specific branches. It did not require any specific corrective action. Harold wrote the bulletin reference number in his notebook. He drew a line connecting it to the Roselyn Foster audit. He drew a second line connecting both to the $40 fee he had paid Vernon Mason in October of 1995. Then he wrote in the notebook 5 states. He closed the notebook. He sat at the table for a long time. It was not just him. It was not just Cedarbrook. It was not just Vernon Mason and his too shiny tie and his too loud watch. It was the holding company. It was a pattern that the Federal Reserve had already identified in 4 other states more than a year ago. And Continental Heritage had not fixed the problem. They had acquired the bank that had the problem. They had filed the paperwork. They had moved on. And somewhere in their corporate offices in Indianapolis, page 9 of the Roselyn Foster audit report sat in a cabinet that nobody was opening. Harold closed the notebook. He drove home. He did not tell Marlene about the bulletin that night. He did not tell her for almost a year. He needed to think about what to do with what he now knew. And the thing he needed to do, the only thing he could think of that made any sense, was to wait, to watch, to take notes, to make sure that whatever came next, when it came, the bank could not bury it the way they had buried the Foster audit. That fall in October of 1996, on the 1-year anniversary of the day, Vernon Mason had charged him $40 in cash. Harold Crawford drove into Cedarbrook and went to the Greene County clerk's office on the 2nd floor of the municipal building. He filled out a form. He paid $112 by check to register and maintain a simple county filing on his property and his name. The filing did not do anything in particular. It was a routine record. The county would generate an annual notice for the rest of his life as long as he kept paying the annual maintenance fee. He paid the fee in April every year after that, always with a check, always on time. He had decided somewhere in the back of his mind that he was going to leave a paper trail, a trail of records year by year that documented his continuous presence as a known party in the county's bookkeeping system. He did not yet know exactly why. He had a feeling the way a man sometimes has a feeling that someday the dates on those checks would matter. That night when he got home, he opened the notebook to a fresh page. He wrote the date. He wrote county filing registered. $112. Will renew every spring. Then he wrote underneath that one receipt at a time. He put a rubber band around the notebook. He put it in the drawer. He went upstairs to find Marlene. For 4 years, Harold Crawford did almost nothing. That is not quite true. He did one thing every April. He drove into Cedarbrook and went up to the 2nd floor of the municipal building, and he paid $112 to the Greene County clerk's office by personal check. And he watched the clerk stamp the receipt and file it in the rotating record book. He kept his copy of every receipt in a manila folder in the 2nd drawer of the metal filing cabinet in his basement workshop. He did this in 1997. He did this in 1998. He did this in 1999. He did this in 2000. That was almost all he did. He went to work at the grain elevator. He drove his forklift. He brought home his paycheck, which he now cashed at a small credit union over in Greenfield, the one he should have driven to in the first place that Tuesday afternoon in October of 1995. He went to church on Sundays with Marlene. He helped Ellie with her algebra when she was 13 and her geometry when she was 14 and her chemistry when she was 15. He fixed the truck. He repainted the porch. He listened to the agricultural report on the radio in the morning. He did not say one word about Vernon Mason or Riverstone or Continental Heritage Financial or examiner Roselyn Foster to anyone outside his own kitchen. The notebook stayed in the drawer. He took it out once a week on Friday evenings after supper. He sat at the workbench in the basement. He read it from the beginning. He added small notes. He thought about what he had. He put it back. Marlene knew what he was doing. She did not ask. She had asked him once in 1996 whether he was going to file a complaint, and he had told her not yet. And that had been the end of it as a topic of conversation. She trusted him. She had married a man who did not raise his voice, and she had not been wrong about him. She did not need to ask the question again. She had her own work and her own life and her own quiet faith that her husband knew what he was doing. In May of 2000, on a Saturday afternoon, a young man knocked on the front door of the Crawford house. Harold answered. The young man was about 31 years old. He was wearing a brown suit that did not quite fit him in the shoulders and brown leather dress shoes that were brand new. He was clean-shaven. His hair was combed. He said, "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Bradley Sutton. I am a customer relations associate with Continental Heritage Financial. I wonder if I might have a moment of your time." Harold looked at him through the screen door. He said, "What is this about?" Sutton smiled. He had been trained to smile. The smile was professional and warm, and went exactly as far as his upper teeth and no further. He said, "Mr. Crawford, our records show that you had an unfortunate experience with one of our affiliated branches some years ago. We are reaching out to valued community members to see if there is anything we can do to make that right." Harold did not open the screen door. He said, "What record?" Sutton said, "Well, sir, we have transaction records going back to 1995. A non-customer fee was assessed on a check cashing transaction. We understand the experience was less than ideal." Harold said, "Who told you to come here?" Sutton's smile adjusted slightly at the edges. He said, "I am here as part of a routine outreach program, sir. Continental Heritage has made it a priority over the past year to reach out to non-customers who may have had concerns about our prior fee schedules." Harold said, "Where did you drive from?" Sutton said, "Indianapolis, sir." Harold said, "You drove from Indianapolis to Cedarbrook, Iowa, to apologize to me about $40 from 5 years ago." Sutton said the company is committed to community relations. Harold said, "What are you offering me, Mr. Sutton?" Sutton said, "Well, sir, that is something we would prefer to discuss in a more formal setting. But I can tell you that the company has authorized a goodwill payment to recognize any past inconvenience. The amount would be discussed at a follow-up meeting with our regional counsel. They can travel here at your convenience." Harold said, "How much?" Sutton said, "Sir, the formal offer would." Harold said, "Mr. Sutton, you drove 4.5 hours to my front door on a Saturday afternoon. You can tell me how much." Sutton hesitated. He had been told before he left Indianapolis that he was not authorized to name a number on the doorstep. He had also been told that if Harold Crawford pressed, he was authorized to mention a range. He chose the range. He said somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000, sir. Harold said $2,800. Sutton said that would be in the range, sir. Harold said, "Thank you for your visit, Mr. Sutton." He closed the door. Sutton stood on the porch for almost a full minute. Then he walked back to his rental car. He drove away. Harold went back to the kitchen. Marlene was at the sink rinsing lettuce. She had heard everything. The screen door was thin. She did not look at him when he came in. She kept rinsing. She said, "Who was that?" He said, "A man from Indianapolis." She said, $2,800. He said, in exchange for never bringing it up again, and a confidentiality clause. She kept rinsing. She said, "You said no." He said, "I said thank you for your visit." She put the lettuce in the strainer. She turned off the water. She dried her hands on the dish towel her mother had given her in 1979. She turned around. She said, "Harold." He said, "Yeah." She said, "What do you know that they do not know?" "You know?" Harold did not answer right away. He thought about that question for a moment. The Foster audit, the Federal Reserve Watch Advisory, the 4 other states. The fact that Continental Heritage had buried the audit and acquired the bank and was now driving customer relations associates 4.5 hours to Iowa to offer $2,800 to a man they did not know, had ever heard of Roselyn Foster. He said more than they think. She nodded once. She said supper at 6. 3 weeks later, a certified letter arrived from a law firm in Indianapolis. The letter ran 2.5 pages. The substance was contained in the second paragraph. Continental Heritage Financial, on a strictly voluntary and good faith basis, was prepared to offer Harold W. Crawford the sum of $2,800 in exchange for a full and final release of all claims arising from or related to the non-customer check cashing transaction of October 17, 1995, including all subsequent and related matters. The release would be confidential. Continental Heritage would admit no wrongdoing. The payment would be made within 10 business days of execution. Harold read the letter once. He folded it. He slid it back into the envelope. He put the envelope in the manila folder in the second drawer of the filing cabinet on top of the audit report and underneath the receipts for the county filings. He did not respond. 3 weeks later, Marlene found the letter when she was looking for the electric bill. She sat down at the kitchen table with it. She read it. She read it again. She put it back in the envelope. She did not say anything. When Harold came home from work that evening, she had supper on the table. They ate. Afterward, while Harold was washing dishes, she said that letter from Indianapolis. He said yes. She said, "You put it in the folder." He said yes. She said, "All right." That was the last thing either of them said about the letter in 2000. The years went by. In 2001, the price of corn dropped 23 cents a bushel. Between September and December, the grain elevator cut Harold's overtime hours. He picked up weekend work at a small lumber yard outside of town to make up the difference. Ellie started high school. She was a thin, quiet girl with her mother's eyes and her father's habit of noticing things other people missed. She made the honor roll. She read constantly. Harold drove her to the public library on Saturdays sometimes, and while she was looking at fiction upstairs, he would go down to aisle 7 and sit at the table where Pauline Reardon had first brought him the binder for 1979. And he would read whatever new bulletins or commentaries the Federal Reserve had published since the last time he had been there. He kept his notebook updated. Nothing changed. Continental Heritage Financial did not appear in any new watch advisories. The fee disclosure pattern that the Foster audit had identified seemed to have gone quiet. Or more likely, it had not gone quiet at all. It had just stopped being looked at. In 2002, Vernon Mason was promoted. The Cedarbrook Courier ran a small piece in the business section. Vernon Mason was now Regional Vice President for Continental Heritage's Iowa operations. He would continue to oversee the Cedarbrook branch, but his responsibilities would expand to include 11 other branches across central Iowa. He had a new title. He had a new corner office in the upstairs portion of the Riverstone building. He had, according to the photograph that accompanied the article, a new watch. Harold cut out the article. He pasted it into the notebook. That was the same year that Ellie, then 19 and home from her first year at Iowa State for spring break, came into the kitchen one afternoon and asked her father a question that nobody had ever asked him before. She said, "Dad, what do you actually do when you go to the library on Saturdays?" He was at the kitchen table going over the truck's maintenance log. He looked up. He thought about how to answer. He said, "I am working on something." She said, "The bank thing." He said yes. She said, "The bank charged you $40 7 years ago." He said yes. She said, "And you are still working on it?" He said yes. She said, "Why?" Harold set down his pen. He turned to face her. Ellie Crawford was 19 years old that afternoon. She was wearing an Iowa State sweatshirt with the Cyclone logo faded from washing. She had her mother's eyes gray and clear, and they were looking at her father the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand. He said because what they did was against a federal law, and nobody made them stop. She said, "Can you make them stop?" He said, "I do not know yet." She said, "What would that take?" He said, "I'm still figuring that out." She nodded. She said, "Can I see the notebook sometime?" He said, "When you are older, if you still want to." She said, "All right." She went upstairs to do her schoolwork. He sat at the table for a long time after she left. He wrote her question in the notebook. He drew a small circle around it. In April of 2003, Harold Crawford was 32 minutes into his shift at the Cedarbrook Grain Processing plant when the forklift he had been operating for the better part of a decade made a sound he had never heard it make before. He was lifting a stacked pallet of 50-pound cornmeal sacks. The load was rated at 840 pounds. The forklift was rated for 2,500. The lift itself should have been routine. What happened next took less than 3 seconds, and Harold remembered all of it for the rest of his life. The hydraulic line on the left mast failed. The mast assembly twisted toward the operator's seat. The pallet, which was 8 feet in the air, shifted on the forks. The bottom row of sacks broke their plastic banding. The top of the load came down on the cab of the forklift. Harold was wearing his hard hat. The hard hat did its job. The bag that hit the hard hat split open against it and dumped cornmeal across the dashboard. The bag that did not hit the hard hat hit Harold across the lower back as he was twisting in the seat to disengage the lift. The bag weighed 50 pounds. It had fallen from 8 feet. It hit Harold's lumbar spine at an angle. He felt the vertebrae go. He did not pass out. He was conscious through all of it. He sat in the forklift seat for almost 30 seconds before he understood that he could not move his legs. The ambulance got there in 11 minutes. 2 of his co-workers held his hand. They were men he had worked alongside for 15 years. Their hands were shaking. His were not. He told them to call Marlene. He told them to tell her he was fine. He told them not to scare her. By then, he was lying on the concrete floor where they had eased him out of the cab, and the pain had started. And the pain was something he did not have words for. But he could still tell his coworkers to be calm, because that was the kind of man he had always been. And he was not going to stop being it lying on a concrete floor in a grain elevator at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday. The diagnosis at the regional hospital in Des Moines was a fracture of the 3rd and 4th lumbar vertebrae. Not a clean break. Compression fractures with displacement. The surgery to stabilize the spine took 5 hours. He was in the hospital for 9 days. He was in a back brace for 11 weeks after that. He could not return to work at the grain elevator for 6 months. The doctors told him he might never lift more than 30 pounds again for the rest of his life. He was 57 years old. The hospital bill, when all of the surgeries and physical therapy and follow-up imaging and prescription medications had been accounted for, came to $47,200. Workers' compensation covered most of his lost wages. His health insurance paid 60% of the medical costs. The remainder after the dust settled was $18,880. The Crawford family did not have $18,880. They had not had $18,880 at any point in their married life. Harold came home from the hospital in late April. Marlene set up a hospital bed in the living room because he could not climb the stairs. She turned the dining room into a physical therapy space. She drove him to his appointments at the rehabilitation clinic in Des Moines every Tuesday and Thursday for the next 4 months. She kept his pain medication on a schedule taped to the refrigerator. She did not complain once. She had asked her parents for help when they were first married and had been turned down, and she had decided then that she was not going to ask anyone else for help for the rest of her life. And she had mostly kept that promise. She did not break it now. In the second week of June, while Harold was sitting in the wheelchair he was using to get from the living room to the kitchen and back, the phone rang. Marlene was at her sewing job. Ellie was at her summer waitressing job at the diner downtown. Harold was alone in the house. He wheeled himself over to the phone. He picked up. The voice on the other end was a man's voice. The man identified himself as Howard Ennis, attorney at law, with the firm of Bradshaw and Carmichael in Indianapolis. He said he was reaching out as part of a periodic review of pending matters, and that he wondered if Mr. Crawford might be open to a renewed conversation about the unresolved transaction matter from 1995. Harold said, "How did you know to call now?" Ennis said, "I am sorry, sir." Harold said, "How did you know now was a good time to call me?" Ennis said, "I am not sure I understand the question, sir." Harold said, "My workplace injury was 8 weeks ago. The hospital bill came in 3 weeks ago. My family is short $18,000 and change. Did somebody at your firm pull the medical billing records, Mr. Ennis, or do you just call once a quarter?" There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Ennis said, "Sir, I can assure you that our firm has no access to medical billing." Harold said, "What is your offer?" Ennis said the firm has been authorized to extend a renewed settlement offer in the amount of $22,000. The offer can be funded within 10 business days. The same terms as the previous offer would apply. Full release, confidentiality, no admission of wrongdoing. Harold said, $22,000. Ennis said, "Yes, sir." Harold said, "You want to know. Now, what is funny, Mr. Ennis?" Ennis said, "What is funny, sir?" Harold said, "The medical bill we cannot pay is $18,880. Your offer is $22,000. $3,120 more than we need. Just enough to feel like generosity." Ennis said, "Sir, I am not sure what you are suggesting." Harold said, "I am suggesting that somebody pulled the bill. I am suggesting that somebody at Continental Heritage knows what I owe to the hospital. I am suggesting that the offer is the bill plus a tip." Ennis said, "Sir, that is not how our firm operates." Harold said, "Mr. Ennis, I am going to think about it." Ennis said, "Of course, sir. Please do think about it. The offer is good for 30 days. You have my number." Harold hung up the phone. He wheeled himself back into the living room. He sat in front of the window. He watched the elm tree in the front yard for almost an hour without moving. That night was the night Harold Crawford came closest to giving up. He did not tell Marlene about the call when she came home from work. He did not tell her at supper. He did not tell her when she helped him into the hospital bed in the living room and tucked the quilt up around his shoulders. He waited until she had gone to bed in their bedroom upstairs at 10:30, and the house was quiet, and the only light was the small lamp on the side table next to the hospital bed. Then he reached over for the phone on the side table. He pulled it toward him. He set it on the quilt across his lap. He thought about Ellie. She was 20 years old. She was at Iowa State, an hour east of home, paying her way through community college and saving for the 4-year program at the university. She had told her parents 2 weeks before Harold's accident that she had decided she wanted to apply to law school after she finished her undergraduate degree. She had said it quietly at the kitchen table over pot roast. She had not asked her parents for money. She had not even asked their opinion. She had just said it out loud, the way a person says a thing they have already decided. Marlene had said, "Oh, honey, that is wonderful." Harold had said, "You will be good at it." Ellie had nodded once. That had been the end of the conversation. $22,000. The hospital bill paid in full. $3,120 left over. Enough for Ellie's first semester of law school books, or enough for the down payment on a small, reliable car she could drive when she started her senior year of college in the fall. He picked up the phone. He dialed the first 6 digits of the Indianapolis number Howard Ennis had given him. He stopped at the 7th. He sat there with the phone in his hand and the dial tone in his ear, and he thought about a man named Vernon Mason, who had once charged him $40 in cash on a check drawn on the bank's own accounts, and who had been promoted to regional vice president 18 months ago, and who was currently sitting somewhere in his new corner office in the Riverstone building wearing a new watch and not thinking about Harold Crawford at all. He thought about a federal examiner named Roselyn Foster who had filed an audit in 1996 identifying the violation. He thought about Vernon Mason's signature on the back of that audit report. He thought about the fact that nothing had ever happened. He thought about a holding company called Continental Heritage Financial that had been on a Federal Reserve watch advisory in 4 other states. He thought about a young man named Bradley Sutton in a brown suit on his front porch in 2000. He thought about an offer of $2,800 in 2000 becoming an offer of $22,000 in 2003. Almost 8 times the original offer. After 3 years of silence, while he was lying in a hospital bed, he thought about Marlene standing at the kitchen sink saying, "What do you know that they do not know you know?" He set the phone back in the cradle. The dial tone stopped. He sat there in the dark for a long time. A floorboard creaked upstairs. He looked up. There was a soft footfall in the hallway, then on the stairs. Marlene came down the stairs in her robe and her slippers. She did not turn on the hallway light. She walked into the living room. She stopped at the foot of his hospital bed. She looked at him. She looked at the phone on the quilt across his lap. She looked back at him. She said, "Who called?" He said, "Indianapolis." She said, "How much?" He said, $22,000. The hospital bill plus $3,000. They know what we owe. She walked around the side of the bed. She sat down on the edge of the mattress next to his good leg. She looked at the phone. She picked it up. She set it on the nightstand. She said, "Harold." He said, "Yes." She said, "They have been waiting 8 years for you to need money." He did not say anything. She said, "Do not give them your back." He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a long quiet. She said, "We will sell the boat. We will refinance the mortgage. I will ask my brother for a loan and I will pay him back the way I should have asked him for help and paid him back 20 years ago. We will find another way." He said, "I almost called." She said, "I know." He said, "I had 6 of the digits in." She said, "I heard the dial tone stop." He looked at her. He said, "You came down here for that." She said, "I came down here because I've been married to you for 27 years, and I know what you sound like when you are trying not to be heard." He laughed once. It was a small, short laugh. It hurt his back. He said, "All right." She said, "All right." She sat with him for a long time. Eventually, she got up. She went into the kitchen. She came back with 2 cups of decaf coffee. She set one on the nightstand next to him. She sat back down on the edge of the bed, and she drank her coffee, and he drank his, and they did not say anything else. When the cups were empty, she got up. She said, "Do not call them in the morning either." He said, "I will not." She said good night. She kissed him on the forehead. She went upstairs. In the morning, Harold called Howard Ennis at the firm in Indianapolis. He told Ennis the offer was declined. He did not give a reason. Ennis sounded surprised. Ennis asked whether there was a counter. Harold said no. Ennis asked whether there was anything Continental Heritage could do to be helpful. Harold said no thank you and hung up. That afternoon, Marlene called her brother in Sioux Falls. She had not spoken to him for 6 years. He agreed to lend them $8,000 at no interest. They sold the bass boat Harold had bought used in 1991 for $4,800. They refinanced the mortgage and took out $4,000 against the equity. Marlene picked up a second part-time job stocking shelves at the Cedarbrook Pharmacy 3 evenings a week. By the end of 2003, they had paid down most of the hospital debt. By the end of 2004, they were even. Harold returned to work at the grain elevator on November 14, 2003, on a doctor's note that limited him to administrative duties. The grain elevator gave him a desk job in the office handling shipping logs and weight tickets. The pay was $3 an hour less than his forklift wage. He did the work without complaint for the next 11 years until he retired in 2014. He kept the notebook updated through all of it. In September of 2010, 6.5 years after the workplace injury, and 7 years after the $22,000 offer, a man named Theodore Brennick flew into Des Moines on a small commercial flight and rented a Lincoln town car and drove the 90 minutes north to Cedarbrook. He had a leather folio with him. The folio was an unusual color. It was the color of a particular kind of South American ostrich leather. He was the kind of man who knew that and wanted other people to know it too. He arrived at the Crawford house at 2 in the afternoon on a Thursday. He had called ahead. Harold had said he could come at 2. Marlene let him in. She poured coffee without being asked. She set the cup on the table in front of him. She set a small plate with 2 cookies on it next to the cup. She did not sit down at the table. She went over to the kitchen counter and stood by the sink drying a glass she had already dried. Brennick set the folio on the table. He did not open it. He said, "Mr. Crawford, thank you for seeing me on short notice. Harold said you flew in this morning." Brennick said I did. Harold said from Chicago. Brennick said, "Yes, sir." Harold said, "Would you like sugar?" Brennick said, "No, thank you." Harold said, "You have something to say." Brennick said, "Sir, the firm I represent has been engaged by Continental Heritage Financial to seek a final resolution of an outstanding matter involving an October 1995 transaction at the Cedarbrook branch. The matter has been pending for some time. The company would prefer to have it concluded." Harold said would prefer. Brennick said very much. Harold said, "All right." Brennick said the firm is authorized to extend a final and best offer in the amount of $19,500, one payment. The terms would be the standard full release, confidentiality, no admission, funded within 10 days. Harold sipped his coffee. He said, "You flew here from Chicago to offer me less than the Indianapolis firm offered me 7 years ago." Brennick said the prior offer was specific to circumstances that no longer apply, sir. The company has reviewed the matter in light of current developments and this represents our final position. Harold said what current developments. Brennick said, statute of limitations consideration, sir. The original transaction occurred 15 years ago. The statute of limitations on most claims arising from that transaction has now run. The firm believes that any claim Mr. Crawford might choose to pursue at this point would be unlikely to succeed on its merits. Harold said you flew here to tell me you do not have to pay me anything. Brennick said, sir, the company is offering $19,500 as a good faith gesture. Harold said you flew here to tell me I have run out of time. Brennick said, sir. Harold said, Mr. Brennick, would you like a cookie? Brennick said, I am sorry. Harold said, Marlene baked them this morning. You drove from Des Moines. You should have a cookie before you drive back. Brennick looked at the plate. He looked at Harold. He picked up a cookie. He took a small bite. He set the cookie back on the plate. Harold said, thank you for the visit, Mr. Brennick. I will think about it. Brennick said the offer is good for 30 days, sir. Harold said, I know. Brennick stood up. He picked up the folio. He thanked Marlene for the coffee. He walked to the front door. He turned in the doorway. He said, Mr. Crawford, I have to ask, is there a reason you have never accepted any of the offers the company has made over the years? Harold said yes. Brennick waited. Harold said the reason is that the company has never asked me what I would accept. They have only told me what they would pay. There is a difference, Mr. Brennick. A man who is asked what he wants is in a conversation. A man who is told what he gets is in a transaction. I do not do transactions with this company anymore. Brennick stood in the doorway for a moment. He said, I see. He left. Harold and Marlene stood in the kitchen and watched the Lincoln Town car back out of the driveway and turn south toward Des Moines. Marlene said, you said no. Harold said, I did not say no. I told him I would think about it. Marlene said, are you gonna think about it? Harold said no. Marlene said, all right. She picked up the plate with the cookies on it. She picked up the coffee cup that Brennick had not finished. She put the cup in the sink. She put the cookies back in the tin. She said, statute of limitations. He said yes. She said, is he right about that? Harold said, I do not know yet. I need to look it up. She nodded. She said, you will look it up. He said, I will. She said, supper at 6. Harold went down to the library that Saturday. Pauline Reardon was still there. She was 73 years old that fall. She still ran the reference desk. She still knew Harold by sight, even though he had stopped coming every week some years before. She did not ask him what he was working on. She brought him the Federal Reserve bulletins he asked for and a fresh cup of coffee from the staff room, and she left him alone. He sat in aisle 7 for 3 hours. He learned that Saturday afternoon that the statute of limitations question Theodore Brennick had raised was not as simple as Theodore Brennick had wanted him to think it was. There was an exception to the statute. The exception was called tolling. Tolling was a legal doctrine that paused the running of the limitations clock under specific circumstances. One of those circumstances was when the conduct giving rise to the claim was the subject of an active federal regulatory examination, and that examination had not been formally closed. Harold thought about the Roselyn Foster audit. The audit had identified the violation in 1996. The audit had recommended follow-up. The follow-up had never occurred. The examination had never been formally closed. The clock had never started. He wrote the word tolling in the notebook. He underlined it 3 times. Then he closed the notebook. He drove home. That night at supper, Marlene asked him whether he had found what he was looking for. He said yes. She said, "Is it good?" He said yes. She said, "All right." She passed him the green beans. In August of 2013, while Harold was sitting on the back porch, watching the neighbor's dog work on a hole near the fence line, and Marlene was inside doing the dishes, a dark blue Buick sedan pulled up across the road from the Crawford property. It parked under the row of maples. It did not get out. The engine ran for almost 15 minutes. Then it shut off. Marlene saw it from the kitchen window. She came out onto the porch. She stood next to Harold and looked at the Buick. She said, "That car has been there since 1 o'clock. Harold said, "I know." She said, "Do you recognize it?" He said, "No." The car stayed where it was for 2 hours. Then it started its engine and drove slowly down Plumridge Road and turned right onto the county highway and was gone. The next morning, Ellie Crawford called from Columbus, Ohio. She was 30 years old. She had graduated from the University of Iowa College of Law in May, and she had been working for 3 months as an associate at a consumer protection firm in Columbus, learning the trade from a senior partner named Marion Holcomb, who specialized in financial services litigation. Ellie was on a small salary. She was paying back her student loans. She lived in a 1-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from her office. She had her father's quiet eyes and her mother's clear gray ones, and a quality of attention that her professors had recognized very early. She said, "Dad." He said, "What is it, sweetheart?" She said, "A man came to the firm yesterday afternoon. He was asking the receptionist questions about me. Personal questions. Where I was from. Whether I had family in Iowa. Who my emergency contact was. He had a name and a card. But Marion looked them up and the firm does not exist. The card was made." Harold sat down at the kitchen table. He said, "What did he look like?" She said, "White mid-40s, dark suit, blue tie. He was driving a dark blue Buick." Harold did not say anything for a moment. Ellie said, "Dad." He said, "Sweetheart." She said, "Is this about the bank?" He said, "I'm going to make a phone call. I'm going to call you back in 20 minutes. She said, "All right." He hung up. He sat at the kitchen table. Marlene came in from the porch. She looked at his face. She said, "Who was that?" He said, "Ellie." She said, "What happened?" He said, "Somebody went to her firm yesterday, asking questions about her. Same Buick." Marlene sat down across from him. She said, "Harold." He said, "I know." She said, "What are you going to do?" He looked at her. He said what should have been done a long time ago. He picked up the phone. He dialed the number for the law firm in Chicago. The number he had written down from Theodore Brennick's business card 3 years before. A receptionist picked up. He asked for Mr. Brennick. A minute later, Brennick came on the line. He said, "Mr. Crawford." "This is a surprise." Harold said, "Mr. Brennick." Brennick said yes. Harold said somebody went to my daughter's law firm in Columbus yesterday. He was asking questions about her. He was driving the same blue Buick that sat outside my house for 2 hours the day before. I'm going to assume for the moment that you and your firm have nothing to do with that. I'm going to assume that some other set of people working for the same company that has been making me offers for 13 years made a decision that is now going to be regretted by everyone involved. Brennick said, "Mr. Crawford, I have no knowledge of any." Harold said, "Mr. Brennick." Brennick said yes. Harold said, I have 7 boxes in my barn. They have been there since 1996. They contain copies of every document I have ever pulled from the Federal Reserve, from the Greene County Clerk's Office, from the State Banking Commission, and from the Cedarbrook Public Library. They contain the original audit report your client received in April of 1996 and signed for and filed and did not act on. They contain 23,000 pages of supporting material I have compiled over the last 17 years. 17 years, Mr. Brennick. There is a lot of material in those boxes. Brennick said, I am listening, Mr. Crawford. Harold said, if anybody goes near my daughter again, if anybody parks in front of my house again, if anybody calls her firm again, those 7 boxes go to the Federal Reserve Regional Office in Kansas City on Tuesday morning. I'm going to drive them there myself. I'm going to put them on the front desk. I'm going to ask for a copy of the receipt. And then I am going to drive home. Are you with me, Mr. Brennick? Brennick said, I am with you, Mr. Crawford. Harold said you should tell whoever needs to be told. Brennick said, I will. Harold said, today, Mr. Brennick. Brennick said, today, Mr. Crawford. Harold hung up. He sat at the kitchen table for a long moment with his hand still on the receiver. Marlene was watching him. She said, Harold? He said, yes. She said, did you have 7 boxes in the barn? He looked at her. He said, I have 3. She said, all right. She got up. She walked over to the coffee pot. She poured them each another cup. The Buick did not come back. The man did not return to Ellie's firm. The phone stopped ringing from Indianapolis. The phone stopped ringing from Chicago. For 4 years, Harold called his daughter back. He told her what was happening. He told her about the audit, about the watch advisory, about the offers over the years, about the boxes in the barn. He told her everything he had been carrying alone for 17 years. Ellie listened without interrupting. When he was done, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, Dad. He said, yes. She said, I am going to start working on this, on my own time. I am going to start pulling everything I can find on tolling under Regulation CC. I'm not going to tell my firm. I'm going to do it myself. He said, sweetheart. She said, this is what I went to law school for, whether I knew it or not. He said, all right. She said, Dad. He said, yes. She said, do not write any more letters to Indianapolis or Chicago without telling me first. He said, I will not. She said, good. She hung up. Harold set the phone down. He went out to the porch. Marlene came out a minute later. They sat in the 2 wicker chairs his father had built in 1964. The neighbor's dog had given up on the hole. The sun was going down over the line of maples across the road. Marlene said she's going to take it on. Harold said she is. Marlene said, were you waiting for that? Harold thought about that for a moment. He said, no. I was waiting for somebody to make a mistake. Marlene said, and they made it. Harold said they did. She said, supper at 6. He said, I will be in. She went inside. He sat on the porch for a little while longer. The sun went down behind the maples. The first stars came out. He thought about a $40 bill on the corner of a desk in October of 1995. He thought about a notebook in a drawer. He thought about the way some things take a long time, and you do not get to choose how long. He went inside. 5 years went by. Harold turned 60 in the spring of 2006. He turned 65 in the spring of 2011. He turned 68 in the fall of 2014. which was the year he retired from the grain elevator, with 34 years of service and a small pension that, combined with his Social Security and Marlene's part-time work at the pharmacy, was enough to keep the house warm and the truck running and the lights on. He kept the notebook updated. The 7 boxes in the barn became 8 boxes, and then 9. He did not call Indianapolis. He did not call Chicago. He did not write any more letters. He had told his daughter he would not write any more letters without telling her first, and he kept that promise. He waited. He paid the $112 to the Greene County clerk's office every April. He kept every receipt. Ellie called him on Sunday afternoons. They talked about her cases, about her clients, about the senior partner, Marion Holcomb, who had become her mentor and was teaching her things you did not learn in law school. They did not talk about the bank very often. They did not need to. Ellie was working on it on her own time, the way she had told him she would, and Harold did not ask for updates because he knew his daughter. And he knew that when she had something to tell him, she would tell him. In February of 2018, she called him on a Tuesday morning. That was unusual. She did not normally call on weekdays. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the Cedarbrook Courier folded open to the agricultural prices when the phone rang. Marlene was at the pharmacy. He picked up. He said hello. Ellie said, "Dad." He said, "What is it, sweetheart?" She said the Federal Reserve issued an amendment to Regulation CC yesterday. It was published in the Federal Register this morning. It is on my desk in Columbus. I'm looking at it right now. He said, "All right." She said, the amendment reaffirms the disclosure requirement for non-customer check cashing fees. It updates the language. It clarifies the enforcement provisions. And it includes a section on private rights of action. He said, "Private rights of action." She said, "Dad, this is the part I have been waiting 18 years for somebody to clarify. The amendment specifies that the private right of action for fee disclosure violations tolls during any period when the institution is under active federal examination for the same conduct. And it specifies that an examination is considered active until it is formally closed by the regulator, not until the bank decides on its own to stop responding." He said the Foster audit was never formally closed. She said no, it was not. He said so, the clock. She said, "The clock never started, Dad." The clock never started. They have been telling themselves for 22 years that the statute of limitations had run. They have been telling everyone else for 22 years that the statute had run. They believed it. They built their settlement strategy around it. And as of yesterday morning, the Federal Reserve has reaffirmed that they were wrong. The clock never started. Harold sat at the kitchen table for a long moment without saying anything. He said, "Ellie." She said, "Dad." He said, "What do we do?" She said, "We file a complaint with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Today. I am going to draft it this week. I am going to use the materials in the boxes. I am going to do it under my name as your attorney of record. We have a window, Dad. I do not know how long the window is open, but it is open right now." He said, "All right." She said, "I am going to come home next month. I am going to drive up from Columbus. I am going to bring my laptop. I am going to sit at your kitchen table with you and Mom for a week, and we are going to organize everything. And then we are going to file." He said, "All right." She said, "Dad." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am proud of you." He said, "Do not say that yet, sweetheart." She said, "Why not?" He said, "Say it after." She said, "All right." She hung up. Harold sat at the kitchen table. He looked at the agricultural prices in the paper. He did not see them. He saw instead the desk in the glass-walled office at Riverstone Community Bank in October of 1995. The blotter. The $40 bills on the corner. Vernon Mason's hands folded on top of them. When Marlene came home from the pharmacy at 4:30, he was still sitting at the table. She came in. She set her purse down. She looked at him. She said, "You have not moved." He said, "Ellie called." She said, "What did she say?" He said, "The rule from 1974. It was reaffirmed yesterday." The clock never started running. Marlene stood very still by the door. She said, "Harold." He said, "We have a window." She said, "When?" He said, "Now." She walked across the kitchen. She sat down across from him at the table. She did not say anything for almost a full minute. Then she said, 23 years. He said 23 years. She put her hand on top of his on the table. He turned his hand over. She held his hand for a long time. Ellie came home in March. She drove the 4 hours from Columbus in a Toyota Camry that had replaced the old car with the broken air conditioning 2 years before. She arrived on a Friday evening with a roller suitcase and a leather briefcase and a laptop and a 3-inch binder of materials she had been compiling on her own time since 2013. She set the binder on the kitchen table. Marlene had supper waiting. The three of them ate together. And then Ellie spread out across the kitchen table for the next 6 days. She drafted the CFPB complaint. Harold pulled the 7 boxes from the barn. 8 boxes. 9 boxes actually by then. They went through every document. They organized them by category. The original transaction receipt, the pamphlet from October of 1995 with no fee disclosure on page 3, the library notes copying out the Federal Reserve commentary on the Bank Secrecy Act of 1974 and the Expedited Funds Availability Act of 1987, the FOIA request from February of 1996, the audit report by examiner Roselyn Foster, the page 9 finding of non-compliance, the routing slip with Vernon Mason's signature dated April 23rd of 1996, the Federal Reserve Watch Advisory on Continental Heritage Financial from November of 1995, the 4 other states, the merger announcement from July of 1996, the promotion of Vernon Mason to Regional Vice President in 2002, the clipping from the Cedarbrook Courier, the visit from Bradley Sutton in May of 2000, the $2,800 offer, the follow-up letter from the Indianapolis law firm 3 weeks later, the decline, the phone call from Howard Ennis in June of 2003, 8 weeks after Harold's workplace injury with the $22,000 offer, the decline, the visit from Theodore Brennick in September of 2010 with the $19,500 offer, the decline, the blue Buick in August of 2013, the call to Ellie's firm in Columbus, the call to Brennick that afternoon, the 4 years of silence that followed, and 23 years of receipts from the Greene County Clerk's Office. $112 every April. Paid by check. Cashed by the county. Acknowledged by Continental Heritage every year through automatic interest statements that they had been generating and mailing to Harold's address on Plumridge Road since the day Riverstone had been acquired in 1996. Harold had not opened a single account with Riverstone or Continental Heritage in his life. He had never asked them to send him anything. They had sent him an annual statement every year anyway because their system did not know how to stop, and because somewhere in their files he was listed as a verified individual in their service area, and because once an institution has put a person on a mailing list, the institution has a hard time forgetting that the person exists. Ellie pulled the statements one by one. She arranged them in chronological order. She wrote on a yellow legal pad in the kind of careful handwriting she had inherited from her father. 23 consecutive years of acknowledgement by the institution that the relationship was ongoing. She filed the CFPB complaint on the morning of Thursday, March 8, 2018. The acknowledgement letter from the CFPB came back 4 days later. It was dated March 12th. It confirmed receipt of the complaint and the opening of a preliminary inquiry under file number CFPB 2018-004812. Ellie made 3 copies. She gave one to Harold. She gave one to Marlene. She kept one for herself. She drove back to Columbus on Sunday morning. For 13 months, almost nothing happened in public. What happened in private was that the CFPB sent a series of inquiry letters to Continental Heritage Financial, requesting documentation related to the disclosure practices identified in the 1996 Foster audit. Continental Heritage produced documents. Their general counsel's office responded with the polite gray language of corporate finance. Their outside counsel from Chicago joined the correspondence. Their outside counsel from Indianapolis joined the correspondence. The matter sat in the inquiry stage for several months. The CFPB requested additional records. Continental Heritage produced additional records. The CFPB asked specific questions. The answers took longer to arrive. Inside Continental Heritage Financial's general counsel's office on the 14th floor of a corporate building in downtown Indianapolis, a senior partner named Marcus Coleman read a manila folder at 6:47 on a Tuesday morning in late March of 2019. He had been at the office since 5. He had not slept the night before. The folder contained a summary of the CFPB inquiry, a chronology of Harold Crawford's contacts with the company going back to 2000, and a memo prepared by an associate the previous Friday, outlining the tolling implications of the Regulation CC Amendment of February 2018. Marcus Coleman read the folder. He set it down. He picked up his phone. He called his senior partner at home. He said, "We have a Crawford problem." The senior partner asked what kind of problem. Coleman said the kind that has receipts. He said it quietly. The kind of quiet that meant he already knew how bad it was. 48 hours after that phone call, Marcus Coleman flew into Des Moines on the company plane. He rented a black Cadillac. He drove the 90 minutes north to Cedarbrook. He brought 2 associates with him. He had called the Crawford house the previous evening. Ellie had answered. Ellie had told him that her father would meet with him at 10 o'clock the next morning at the house on Plumridge Road. Ellie had driven up from Columbus the night before. She had arrived at 9:30 in the evening. Harold had been waiting in the kitchen with the binder on the table. Marlene had made supper. They had eaten. Then they had gone over everything one more time. At 9:55 on a Thursday morning in late March of 2019, a black Cadillac pulled into the driveway of the Crawford house on Plumridge Road. 3 men got out. The senior of the 3 was Marcus Coleman. He was 56 years old. He was wearing a charcoal suit. He had a leather briefcase. He had the careful energy of a man who had been briefed to stay calm. They came to the door. Harold answered. He let them in. He led them to the kitchen. Ellie was at the kitchen table. She was wearing a navy blazer and a white blouse. She had her laptop open in front of her and the 3-inch binder on the table beside the laptop. Marlene was at the stove. She did not turn around. She had decided the night before that her role in this meeting was to be a person who poured coffee. She poured 4 cups. She set them on the table without asking. She set out a small pitcher of cream in a sugar bowl. Then she stepped back to the kitchen counter and stood with her back to the room and dried a glass she had already dried. Marcus Coleman opened his briefcase. He took out a folio. He set it on the table. He said, "Mr. Crawford, Miss Crawford, thank you for meeting with us this morning. Harold said you are welcome. Coleman said I would like to begin by saying that Continental Heritage Financial takes very seriously the concerns that have been raised in the CFPB inquiry. We have been cooperating fully with the Bureau's process. We have produced all of the documents that have been requested. We are committed to a constructive resolution." Ellie said, "Mr. Coleman." Coleman said yes. Ellie said you flew in from Indianapolis this morning. You have driven 90 minutes north. You are sitting at my parents' kitchen table. You did not come here to talk about cooperating with the CFPB. You came here to make an offer. Tell us the offer." Coleman looked at her. Coleman had been told before he left Indianapolis that the Crawford daughter was an associate at a consumer protection firm in Columbus, and that she was 35 years old, and that she had been admitted to the Ohio bar in 2014. He had been told that she was the attorney of record on the CFPB complaint. He had not been told what she was like in a room. He was finding out. He said the company has authorized me to extend a comprehensive settlement offer of $95,000. Full release confidentiality, no admission. Funded within 10 business days. Ellie did not say anything for a moment. She turned to the binder. She opened it to the first tab. She turned the binder around so that the writing faced across the table. She slid it toward the middle. The first tab contained a printed copy of the Federal Reserve's Amendment to Regulation CC from February of 2018. Specific provisions were highlighted in yellow. She said, "This is the Amendment to Regulation CC that was published last February. The highlighted sections reaffirm that the private right of action for fee disclosure violations under the Bank Secrecy Act of 1974 and the Expedited Funds Availability Act of 1987 tolls during any period when the institution is under active federal examination for the same conduct." She turned to the second tab. The second tab contained the Roselyn Foster audit report from April of 1996. Page 9 was marked with a yellow flag. She said, "This is the audit your client received in April of 1996. The audit identified the disclosure violation. The audit recommended follow-up. The follow-up never occurred. The examination has never been formally closed. Under the tolling provisions of the amendment, the statute of limitations on my father's claim has not yet begun to run. It began to be tolled in April of 1996, and it has been tolled continuously for 23 years. She turned to the third tab. The third tab contained 23 consecutive years of annual interest statements that Continental Heritage Financial had been sending to Harold Crawford's mailing address on Plumridge Road. She said, "In addition, your client has been sending my father an annual statement every year for 23 years. That correspondence constitutes acknowledgement of an account relationship by the institution. Whether or not the institution intended that acknowledgement is not relevant under Iowa law. The acknowledgement once made restarts the clock under the general statute of limitations for related claims even without reference to the tolling provisions of Regulation CC." She turned to the fourth tab. The fourth tab contained the CFPB acknowledgement letter dated March 12, 2018. She said, "My father is not a party to the 2014 class action settlement that resolved related claims for other affected customers. The settlement agreement explicitly did not release individual claims from non-parties. The CFPB inquiry that opened last year is a continuing federal regulatory matter. The matter is open. The matter is being actively investigated." She closed the binder. She looked at Marcus Coleman. She said, "$95,000 is not the offer. Tell us the offer." Coleman looked at the binder. He looked at his associates. The associate on his left was typing very quickly on a laptop. The associate on his right had stopped typing. Coleman said, "I need to make a call." Harold said, "The phone is in the hallway. There is a chair. Take your time." Coleman stood up. He walked into the hallway. He closed the door behind him. Harold, Marlene, and Ellie sat at the kitchen table. The two associates sat across from them. Nobody said anything. Marlene poured them all another cup of coffee. The associate on the right thanked her. The associate on the left did not look up from his laptop. Coleman was gone for 7 minutes. When he came back in, he sat down. He put his hands flat on the table. He said, "What number are we talking about?" Ellie said, $847,500. No confidentiality clause. Public consent agreement. Fee disclosure notices posted in plain English at every non-customer service window in all 53 current Continental Heritage branches. Quarterly compliance reporting to the CFPB for a period of 5 years. Coleman said the last several points are unusual. Harold said they were the original requirements. Coleman said, "I understand that." Harold said, 1974. Coleman did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I need to make another call." He went back into the hallway. This time he was gone for almost 20 minutes. When he came back, he sat down. He said, "We can do the number. We can do the disclosure notices. We can do the compliance reporting. We will need to negotiate the scope of the consent agreement language. We cannot accept a public admission of intentional concealment. We can accept findings of regulatory non-compliance." Ellie said that is acceptable. Coleman said we will need a draft to take back to Indianapolis. We can have a final document ready for your review within 10 business days. Ellie said, "I will send you the draft on Monday." Coleman nodded. He gathered up his folio. He stood up. The associate stood up. He looked at Harold. He said, "Mr. Crawford, I have to ask, why now?" Harold said, "Why now what?" Coleman said, "You have been a private man about this for 23 years. We have been making offers in good faith for 19 of those years. Every one of them was declined. Why this year?" Harold said, "Mr. Coleman." Coleman said yes. Harold said you sent a man in a blue Buick to my daughter's law firm in August of 2013. Coleman did not move. Harold said, "I did not know the man's name. I do not know which of your offices sent him. I assume you do not know either. But I know what was in his car. And I know what he was asking the receptionist at my daughter's firm." Coleman said, "Mr. Crawford, I have no knowledge." Harold said, "I am not asking you to apologize for it. I am answering your question. You asked why now. The answer is that for 23 years, this was about $40 in a federal rule. It was a small thing. I was patient about it because it was small and because being patient cost me nothing. And then in August of 2013, it stopped being about $40. It stopped being small, and I stopped being patient. Coleman looked at Harold for a long moment. He said, "I understand." He walked to the door. The associates followed him. They walked out to the Cadillac. They got in. They drove away. Harold and Marlene and Ellie sat at the kitchen table. Ellie said, "Dad." Harold said, "Yes." She said, "You just got $47,500. He said, "I know." Marlene said, "Harold." He said, "Yes." She said, "You put it down twice." He said, "What?" She said, "The phone. June of 2003. And then on the porch in August of 2013 when Ellie called. He said, "I remember." She said, "You put it down both times." He said, "You put it down for me both times." She did not say anything. She got up. She walked over to the stove. She turned on the kettle. She made tea. She made it the way she had been making it for 42 years. The bank filed a motion to dismiss 3 weeks later. This was a surprise to Ellie. She had expected the company to honor the verbal agreement Coleman had made at the kitchen table. She had drafted the consent agreement on Monday as she had promised. She had sent it to Coleman by certified mail. She had not received a written response. Instead, on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-April, she received a notice from the Greene County District Court that Continental Heritage Financial had filed a motion to dismiss the underlying claim on grounds of abandonment. The motion argued that even if the statute of limitations had told under the Regulation CC amendment, Harold Crawford had abandoned any private claim he might have had by failing to formally pursue it for 23 years. The motion cited a doctrine called laches. Laches was an equitable principle that allowed a court to dismiss a claim if the plaintiff had unreasonably delayed in pursuing it, and the delay had prejudiced the defendant. Ellie read the motion at her desk in Columbus. She called her father at home. She said, "Dad." He said, "What is it?" She said, "They are going to court." He said, "All right." She said, "I am driving up tomorrow. We have a hearing in 3 weeks. I need you to come with me." He said, "I will." The hearing was held at the Greene County Courthouse in Cedarbrook on a Wednesday morning in early May of 2019. The hearing officer was a county district judge named Patricia Whelan. She was 62 years old. She had been on the bench for 14 years. She had grown up on a farm 40 miles southwest of Cedarbrook, and she had been a public defender for 9 years before she ran for the bench. She had the kind of face that did not give anything away. Marcus Coleman did not attend the hearing. The bank was represented by a junior partner from the Indianapolis firm and a local counsel from Des Moines. Ellie sat at the plaintiff's table with her father. Marlene sat in the front row of the gallery. The courtroom was nearly empty. There were 3 retired men in the back row who came to courthouse hearings the way some men go to the diner. They sat quietly with their hats in their laps. The bank's counsel made his argument first. He argued that 23 years of inaction constituted abandonment as a matter of law. He argued that the bank had made multiple good faith settlement offers over the years, all of which had been declined without counterproposal or formal pursuit. He argued that the recent CFPB complaint, filed only after the Regulation CC amendment was published, was an opportunistic effort to revive a claim that had been allowed to lapse. He spoke for 14 minutes. When he sat down, Ellie stood up. She walked to the bench. She handed the bailiff 3 documents. The bailiff handed them up to Judge Whelan. She said, "Your Honor, the first document is the Foster audit. The second document is the Regulation CC Amendment of February 2018. The third document is a record of 23 consecutive annual property filings made by my father at the Greene County Clerk's Office on the second floor of this building beginning in October of 1995 and continuing through April of 2019, accompanied by 23 consecutive annual interest statements sent by Continental Heritage Financial to my father's mailing address on Plumridge Road. Judge Whelan looked at the documents. Ellie said, "Your Honor, the doctrine of lash applies when a party has unreasonably delayed in pursuing a claim, and the delay has prejudiced the defendant. My father did not unreasonably delay. My father acted reasonably within his means and his understanding throughout the entire 23-year period. He filed a Freedom of Information Act request 4 months after the original transaction. He obtained the federal audit report. He documented every contact made by the bank. He preserved every receipt. He paid $112 to this county every April for 23 years to maintain his continuous presence on the public record. The county taxed him. The bank acknowledged him through annual correspondence. The relationship was continuous, documented, and bilateral. You cannot abandon something the county keeps billing you for, Your Honor, and you cannot abandon something the institution itself keeps acknowledging through automatic correspondence for 23 years. She paused. She said the bank did not lose the original audit. The bank did not misplace the file. The bank received the audit on April 23rd of 1996. The audit was signed for by the branch manager. The audit was filed in the bank's records. The audit identified the disclosure violation that is the subject of this proceeding. The bank had every opportunity to correct the violation. The bank chose not to. The bank acquired the institution that had the violation. The bank kept charging the fee. The bank made my father a series of settlement offers over the years to keep him from pursuing the violation in public. My father declined those offers. He did not act. He did not need to act. The clock was told the entire time, and the bank knew it was told because the bank was the institution that had failed to close the examination. She walked back to the plaintiff's table. She sat down. Judge Whelan looked at the documents for a long time. She set them down on the bench. She looked at the bank's counsel. She said, "The motion is denied." The bank's counsel started to speak. She said, "Counsel." He stopped. She said, "The motion is denied. The matter is not abandoned. The plaintiff has demonstrated continuous acknowledgement by both parties of an ongoing legal relationship. The plaintiff has demonstrated reasonable diligence within the means available to him. The bank's argument that the plaintiff failed to act fails on its face. The bank's argument that the bank is prejudiced by the plaintiff's failure to act is frankly surprising in light of the bank's own role in the underlying violation. The motion is denied. Counsel will confer regarding the consent agreement that was apparently agreed to at the kitchen table on a Thursday morning in March, and the parties will return to my courtroom in 30 days with a signed final document for my review and approval. We are adjourned." She struck the gavel. She left the bench. The bank's counsel was on his phone before he was out of the courtroom. Harold and Ellie and Marlene walked out of the courthouse together. They walked down the marble steps onto the sidewalk on Front Street. The May sunlight was bright. The 3 retired men in the back row of the gallery had come out behind them. They tipped their hats to Marlene as they passed. One of them tipped his hat to Harold. Harold tipped his cap back. They drove home in Ellie's car. In the kitchen, Marlene put on the kettle. Ellie said, "Dad." Harold said, "Yes." She said, "It is over." He said, "No, sweetheart." She said, "What do you mean, no?" He said, "The paperwork is what comes next. The paperwork takes a few weeks. The first check comes after that. The check is the start. It is not over yet." Ellie said, "All right." She made tea. The signed consent agreement was filed with the Greene County District Court on Tuesday, May 21, 2019. The terms were as Ellie had negotiated: $847,500 payable as a one-time settlement amount, plus monthly inflation-adjusted payments for the remainder of Harold Crawford's life, with full transfer to his surviving heirs. No confidentiality clause. Public consent agreement filed in the court record. Fee disclosure notices in plain English to be posted at every non-customer service window in all 53 current Continental Heritage branches by the 1st of September. Quarterly compliance reporting to the CFPB for a period of 5 years. The signing took place at the Greene County Clerk's office on the second floor of the municipal building. Harold wore the canvas jacket. The seam in the left pocket had been mended 16 years before by his wife on an evening in the winter of 2003, when he was lying in the hospital bed in their living room and could not climb the stairs. He had not known she had mended it. She had done it while he was sleeping. He had only discovered it years later when his fingers had brushed the inside seam by accident, and he had felt the neat row of stitches Marlene had put there without telling him. He signed where Ellie pointed. When the signing was done, he walked out of the building with Marlene and Ellie. They stood on the second floor landing for a moment. Then they walked down the staircase to the first floor. Then they walked out the front doors. Harold drove home alone. Ellie and Marlene followed in Ellie's car. Harold wanted a few minutes to himself. He stopped in the parking lot of the Cedarbrook Grain Processing plant, where he had worked for 34 years, where his forklift had failed in April of 2003. He sat in the truck for a while. He opened the 7th notebook. He wrote the date. He wrote signed. Monthly payments begin October. Everything in order. Then he thought for a moment. He wrote one more line. He wrote 23 years, one receipt, one rule they forgot they had to follow. He closed the notebook. He put the rubber band around it. He drove home. 3 days later, on a Friday morning, the Cedarbrook Courier ran a short article on page 3 of the local section. 2 paragraphs. The article identified Continental Heritage Financial. It identified the federal consent agreement. It identified the disclosure requirement from 1974. It did not identify Harold Crawford by name. The court filing was public record, and his name could be looked up by anyone who wanted to. But the Courier had chosen, in the small mercy of small-town journalism, not to put the name in the lead. Vernon Mason, now 71 years old, retired and living on the east side of Cedarbrook, in a 1-story brick house on Sycamore Street, read the article over his morning coffee. He did not comment. He set the paper down. He looked out the kitchen window at the backyard. 2 men who had once stood at the teller windows of Riverstone Community Bank on a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1995 read the article separately in separate houses, and neither one called the other. The town moved on. It always did. On a Saturday morning in September of 2019, Harold Crawford drove into Cedarbrook to pick up his mail at the post office. The September air had the first edge of fall in it. The cottonwoods along Main Street were just starting to turn. He parked the truck on Front Street. He walked 1 block to the post office. He went inside. Vernon Mason was standing at the parcel counter. He was alone. He was wearing a gray flannel shirt that was loose in the shoulders. His hair was almost completely white now. His hands trembled slightly as he counted out change to the postal clerk. The Rolex was gone. He was wearing a plain steel watch that had probably cost $40 at the drugstore. He turned with his parcel under his arm, and he saw Harold Crawford standing by the post office boxes on the opposite wall. He stopped. He looked at Harold for what could not have been more than 4 or 5 seconds, but felt to both men like considerably longer. He did not smile. He did not raise his hand. He did not look angry. He did not look ashamed. He looked like a man who had been thinking for the last 6 months about a Tuesday afternoon in October of 1995, and who had run into the one face from that afternoon that he had not expected to see today. Harold looked back. He did not look away. He did not nod. He did not do anything. After a moment, Vernon Mason gave him a small nod. The kind of nod a man gives across a small room in a small town when there is nothing left to say. Harold nodded back, the smallest possible nod, the same nod his own grandfather had taught him to give decades before, in a different town, in a different state, in the same kind of situation. The nod that said, "I see you. I know who you are. I know who you were." There is nothing else. Vernon Mason walked out of the post office. He got into a 10-year-old Ford Taurus parked at the curb. He drove away. Harold collected his mail. He walked back to his truck. He sat in the cab for a moment. He opened the 7th notebook to the last written page. He wrote the date. He wrote Met V at post office. Both old now. Both still alive. Nothing else to say. He closed the notebook. He put the rubber band around it. He drove home. The first monthly payment from the consent agreement arrived in the mail on Tuesday, October 1st, 2019. It was a check. Marlene had asked specifically for the payments to be made by check, rather than by electronic transfer. She had said on the day they signed the agreement that she wanted a piece of paper she could hold. Ellie had asked her why. Marlene had said, "Because for 23 years your father has been keeping pieces of paper, and now somebody else is going to send him pieces of paper. And I think it is fair." The check came in a plain white envelope. There was no logo on the envelope. There was no return address other than a post office box in Indianapolis. Harold opened it at the kitchen table. He looked at the check. He set it down. Marlene sat down across from him. She looked at the check. She did not pick it up. She said, "What do we do with it?" Harold said, "We cash it." She said, "Where?" He said, "The credit union in Greenfield." She said, "All right." He said, "Do you want to drive over with me?" She said yes. They drove the 40 minutes to Greenfield that afternoon. They went into the credit union where Harold had cashed his paychecks since the fall of 1995. The teller was a young woman Harold had not seen before. She processed the check without asking any questions. She counted out the cash. She slid it across to Harold in a paper sleeve. He thanked her. They walked out to the parking lot. In the truck, Harold opened the paper sleeve. He counted the bills. He set the sleeve down between them on the bench seat. Marlene looked at the sleeve. She said, 23 years. He said, 23 years. She said, "What does it feel like?" He thought about it. He said, "It does not feel like winning." She nodded. She said, "I did not think it would." He said, "It feels useful, like a thing got done that needed doing. The way it feels when you finally fix something that has been broken in the house for a long time. You do not celebrate it. You just stand in the room afterward and you notice that the thing is not broken anymore." She said, "That is enough." He said yes. They drove home. That evening, Harold went down to the basement workshop. He opened the second drawer of the metal filing cabinet. He took out the first notebook, the blue composition notebook from the Cedarbrook Drug Store. $1.19. The cover was faded now. The corners were soft from 24 years of being opened and closed and read by lamplight. The rubber band had been replaced 6 times. The current rubber band was 8 months old. He opened the notebook to the first page. He read the first entry, the date in his own handwriting from October 17th of 1995, the transaction number, the check number. The words, "They charged me to cash my own money." He read it once. He closed the notebook. He put the rubber band back around it. He set it down on the workbench. He sat at the bench for a long time. He thought about the Tuesday afternoon when he had walked into a bank with a payroll check in his hand and walked out with a pamphlet and a paper sleeve and a question he could not put down. He thought about the way some questions stay with a man for the rest of his life if he lets them. He thought about the way his father had taught him when he was 12 years old, that the most important thing a man does is keep his word, even when nobody is watching, even when nobody is asking, even when keeping it costs him something he cannot put back. He had not understood when he was 12 what his father had meant by the costs. He understood now. He thought about Marlene at the screen door in 2000, about Marlene on the edge of the hospital bed in 2003, about Marlene at the kitchen sink with her back to him in the spring of 2010. He thought about Ellie at the kitchen table in March of 2018, about Ellie standing in front of Judge Whelan in May of 2019, about the daughter who had grown up watching her father work on a thing that nobody asked him to work on, and who had decided somewhere along the way that she would learn the work that would let her finish it. He closed the drawer. He went upstairs. Marlene was on the back porch. She was sitting in one of the 2 wicker chairs his father had built in 1964. She had a cup of tea in her hand. The sun was going down over the line of cottonwoods at the back of the lot. He sat down next to her. He did not say anything. She did not say anything either. The light went out of the sky slowly the way it does in October in Iowa. The cottonwoods went dark. The first stars came out one by one. Some men get angry at the window. Harold Crawford got a notebook. $40 taken in October of 1995. $847,500 returned beginning October of 2019. He never raised his voice once. The notebook keeps the receipt. Sooner or later, the receipt keeps the man.